good evening, everyone. I'm excited to talk to you tonight about the changes to 2020 census geographies for New York City. So let me just start by saying, well, we're all likely aware the Census Bureau publishes data at various geographic summary levels, so including for states, for cities, for counties. But here in New York City, we're obviously interested in what's going on within our boroughs, within our neighborhoods, our community districts. And so particularly the small area geographies such as census tracts are of interest to us for many of our analyses. And these census tracts tend to change their boundaries more often than the larger geographies like cities and counties, which don't typically change very often. And with every decennial census, there have been sometimes significant changes to the census tracts, and there have been this go around following the 2020 census. I'll get into that. And with these changes, the Department of City Planning took the opportunity to introduce a new geography, which I'll explain, and make some changes to our neighborhood tabulation areas. So first, I want to start with just an overview of kind of the geographic paradigm when we're looking at our sub-borough geographies that we had in 2010, following the 2010 census, and how broadly that has shifted for this new 2020 geographic paradigm at the sub-borough level. So as you see, I've illustrated on the above section of this slide, the 2010 census geography paradigm for New York City. Kind of, you had census tracts on the smaller end, which are these groupings of census blocks, typically aligned with what you would think of as a typical street block. Those nested within our NTAs, or neighborhood tabulation areas. And if you aren't familiar with any particular acronym that you see here, don't worry, because I'm going to explain it all as we go. And those neighborhood tabulation areas in turn nested within Pumas, public use microdata areas, which in New York City, which the Census Bureau publishes, but in New York City, they roughly line up with our community districts. And I'll talk about just how rough that relationship really is. Now in 2020, following the 2020 census, the Pumas are still around. They haven't gone anywhere, and actually the boundaries haven't changed yet. But you'll notice the big difference here is that we've got this new geography around the community district tabulation areas. That's what city planning has published. So it's not a Census Bureau geography, it's a New York City planning geography. And that better represents or better aligns with the community districts that we have in New York City. And we have reconfigured neighborhood tabulation areas, which previously aligned with the Pumas or nested within Pumas, to now nest within these community district tabulation areas. Census tracts continue to form the building blocks for all of these geographies, really, for the neighborhood tabulation areas that fit within CDTAs, and they also are building blocks for the Pumas. So I'm going to sort of dive deeper into each of these. I'm going to start just outline what the community districts are, why they're important, and then go from the larger geographies on down to the census tracts, talk about the changes within each. And at the end, I'll give you some resources for where you can actually download data and actually the boundary shape files for all of the geographies I'm going to be talking about tonight. So let's start with the community districts. So as you may be aware, New York City is divided into 59 community districts within our boroughs. And these are served by community boards that are appointed by the mayor, borough presidents, and city councilors. And one thing about community districts, even though they're very important geographies for us here in New York City, they are in the end a New York City geography. They're not a federal geography. They're not an officially supported Census Bureau geography. And that means that the Census Bureau does not publish data directly for community districts. So the city charter actually mandates that the once a decade decennial census data actually be produced for these community districts. And city planning handles that. We do a special tabulation every decade. So we just got done with that for 2020. to issue the populations in the 2020 census data for community districts. But in the interim, between census period, we have to rely on Pumas to get annually updated American Community Survey data that you may be familiar with. And Pumas loosely approximate community districts, so even though it's not a perfect fit, it's kind of the best we can do in matching the American Community Survey data to our CDs and continue to update and get more detailed data for them throughout the decade, and as we wait for each decennial census update. So what are these Pumas? Well, as I mentioned before, it stands for Public Use Microdata Areas. They are built out of Census Tracts. They're an official Census Bureau geography, and the Census Bureau has particular stipulations and guidelines for how Pumas can be created. So they have a minimum population threshold of 100,000, and that's a hard threshold. They cannot dip below 100,000 population. In New York City, Pumas fit within boroughs, or county boundaries. Now, it's not always true across the country that Pumas don't cross county boundaries, but it is in New York City. And one of the great things about Pumas is that they allow you to access PUMS data or microdata from which you can do special cross tabulations, and allows for different kinds of analyses that aren't available with the normal census data and ACS data. Now, what's going on with the Pumas post-2020 census? Well, the existing Pumas and Puma boundaries are going to continue to get updated with new data. There will be a coming update to the Puma boundaries. I have written here 2023, 2024, weren't quite sure what the end timeline was going to be with that. It's looking like it may actually be closer to 2022 or late 2022. Not totally sure when those Puma boundaries will actually be released yet. But when the Puma boundaries are updated, we expect that because of changes in the population and some changes to census tracts, they will improve their alignment with community districts. Which sounds great, but there are some inbuilt limitations with Pumas as far as their representation of community districts that I'll explain. So first of all, there's only 55 Pumas in New York City, and remember there are 59 community districts. So right there, right off the bat, you know, something's got to give. You're never going to have a perfect one-to-one relationship between Pumas and CDs in New York City. Now, some community districts actually straddle borough boundaries. For example, Queens CD1 actually crosses into the Bronx and includes Rikers Island, which is part of the Bronx. And the Bronx CD8 crosses into Manhattan and includes Marble Hill, which is part of Manhattan. Now, Pumas can't or don't cross county lines in New York City. So that's a limitation as far as representing those community districts well. And then remember that 100,000 person threshold that Pumas can't fall below. Well, some community districts actually have fewer than 100,000 people. So that means that when a Puma is intended to represent a CD with fewer than 100,000 people, it has to actually combine two small community districts next to each other together in one Puma, which is not ideal, or it has to borrow population from an adjacent community district, and that throws off not just the match for the CD that you're trying to represent, but also the neighbors from which you borrow population. So all of those factors mean that the Puma to CD relationship is relatively rough as it stands. Which brings us to community district tabulation areas. What are these CDTAs? Well, it kind of DCP's answer to some of the looseness in this relationship between Pumas and CDs, because we're really interested in consistently getting access to ACS data that really more closely represents the CDs than the Pumas currently offer. So as community district tabulation areas, they will also be built out of census tracts. So they'll be built out of the new 2020 census tracts. which city planning actually worked closely with the Census Bureau to guide some of the splits this go around of the census tracts. And we did that with an eye towards allowing the tracts to align better with community districts so that we would be able to create CDTAs that are actually better reflections of the CD. And I'll get into some examples of exactly how we did that. Now with CDTAs, we did not constrain ourselves with that 100,000 population threshold that Pumas have from the Census Bureau's end. So we allow ourselves to go as low or as high in population as we need to in order to match the CD as best we can using the census tracts. And then also with CDTAs, we allowed the geography to cross borough boundaries when necessary in order to best represent the CDs. So for Bronx 8 and for Queens 1, we crossed the boundaries there to grab Marble Hill and Rikers Island, respectively, to represent those CDs well. Now, as far as what I was talking about with where we worked with the Census Bureau to create better alignment as far as the new census tracts, I've got some examples illustrated above. Queens CD4 on the left, Brooklyn CD7 on the right. The thick gray lines on these maps are the CD boundaries, and you'll see highlighted in yellow are the 2010 census tracts that we targeted. We targeted tracts that were straddling those community district boundaries, and where we identified that these tracts had enough population and enough housing units on both sides of the CD line to remain viable census tracts, so they could stand alone. We wouldn't be, just creating a tiny sliver of a census tract on one side that really had population. We wanted them to be viable. And wherever we found that we could do that, we asked the Census Bureau, okay, so here, Queens CD4, could you please split these census tracts along Roosevelt Avenue, which forms the CD boundary. On the right-hand side, in Brooklyn CD7, we said, could you split them along 8th Avenue and Sunset Park, along the southern part of Windsor Terrace there, the southern part of Park Slope. And we ended up with tract splits that we could then reallocate to the proper CD, and then re-aggregate all the tracts up to create these CDTA geographies that are actually be better representations of the CD than we had before. So now with these resulting CDTAs, we of course had to create a GeoID for them. And one issue that we saw with the 2010 Puma GeoIDs was that even though they were loosely aligned with the CDs, they didn't have, the code wasn't indicating what CD each Puma was corresponding to. And we wanted the CDTA codes to be very intuitive as far as, being easy to know what borough you're working with, what CD you're working with. So no longer will you have to, either use a lookup table or memorize that, Puma 4104 corresponds to CD Queens 11. With the CDTAs, we coded it, the first two, 4 characters, the first 2 being alpha indicating the borough, the second 2 being numeric matching the CD number. So QN11 corresponds to Queens CD 11 and so on. Pretty straightforward. You always know what CD you're working with. Now, there are also areas across the city that are not a part of any particular CD. These tend to be some of the largest parks, like Central Park, Prospect Park, Pelham Bay, and then the airports, so LaGuardia and JFK. Joint interest areas actually have their own official numbers, just like CDs. So Pumas actually combine these joint interest areas in with whatever the nearest CD was, because Pumas represent the entire, all the census tracts within New York City or within each county. For our CDTAs, we didn't want the joint interest areas, which do have trace amounts of population, to kind of throw off the population match. So we represent them separately. They're separated out, they're coded, following that same 4-character CDTA method. So for Central Park, you get MN64, LaGuardia, QN80, and so forth. Now, we have, as I said, 59 CDTAs for 59 CDs instead of the 55 Pumas that you had. So that allows us to better deal with situations like CDs 1 and 2 in lower Manhattan, which both had too small of a population to stand alone as Pumas. Well, now using CDTAs, we were able to represent them separately. And as you see, we also kind of buffed out the boundary there for CD1 towards Chinatown to create a better match for both of these CDs. And now when you want to pull ACS data, if you turn to a CDTA, you can really get distinct ACS data for CD1 and CD2, which for the Puma, we're pulling data for both together. Now you may or may not be aware that here at City Planning, we have some nicknames for some of the Pumas. My favorite was Puma 4802, which represents Brooklyn CD4 or the Bushwick area, which we know as Myrtle the Turtle. Myrtle Avenue runs right through the center of it. We kind of see the Brooklyn boundary as the shell, and then it's got a head sticking up into East Williamsburg and a foot that sticks over into Bed-Stuy. And the issue with Myrtle is actually that head was sticking across the CD boundary here, the yellow area being Brooklyn CD1, whereas the bluish area is Brooklyn CD4, which that Puma is roughly supposed to correspond to. And those areas were leading to this Puma only matching the CD's population by 87%, 87% population match. So with our CDTAs, when we got to Myrtle, unfortunately, we had to decapitate the turtle, but it was for a good cause because we ended up with a 100% population match. So now when you pull data for the CDTA, you can be confident that it is well representative of Brooklyn CD4. But I can tell you that Myrtle's legacy, turtles in the area, lives on. As Jim mentioned in my introduction, I did a lot of field canvassing work throughout the city in preparation for the 2020 census. I spent some time in the area around Myrtle Avenue, and at two locations close by Myrtle Avenue, I saw turtles on kind of the front porch areas of houses. So this is an actual picture that I took in some of my census field canvassing. So I know that Myrtle's spirit is somehow living on in the area. Now, we went CD by CD across the city. We gave them all the same treatment that you saw with Lower Manhattan and with the Bushwick area there. And this is what we came up with. So in these two maps, I'm showing you on the left the relationship between Pumas and CDs and how well the Pumas matched the population. And then on the right, with the same breaks, how well the CDTAs represent the population of CDs. So if you look on the right, you notice there's a lot more green on this map. We were able to improve from just 3 Pumas that had an exact or 100% population match to now 12 CDTAs where you'll get 100% match. And where we weren't able to get to 100%, we were able to improve across the board. So you'll notice that all but 3, we were able to get at least a 95% match. And even with those 3 lowest, have all improved from what they were previously with their Puma as far as matching their CD. And you can see we were able to do particularly well in Upper and Lower Manhattan, where most of those CDs we got to be an exact match. Now, I do want to call out some limitations to CDTAs. Now, what I was talking about is sort of a feature in one way, if you're not aware of it, or it could throw you off, depending on what you're doing, which is that CDTAs will not actually add up to the boroughs for the Bronx, Manhattan, and Queens, and that's again because of what we did for Marble Hill and Rikers Island. For Brooklyn and Staten Island, of course, they will add up to the borough. And another important thing to keep in mind is this is a city planning published geography. It's not a Census Bureau geography, so that means it is not going to get PUMS data. It's not a PUMS geography, so for PUMS data, you will need to continue to rely on Pumas, which, as I said, when those boundaries are updated, we expect them to improve their alignment with CDs, but not to the extent that CDTAs do. So a couple of things to keep in mind with CDTAs. Now, CDTAs, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, have some implications for our NTAs. Now, one reason that NTAs previously nested within Pumas is because, well, Pumas were the closest thing we had to representing CDs at the time as far as census-related geographies. And every CD has kind of this list of neighborhoods that it sees as sort of constituent neighborhoods that it seeks to represent. And we wanted the NTAs to reflect that. And so as they nested within Pumas before, now that we have a geography that better reflects CDs, we reconfigured NTAs to nest within the CDTAs. And we think this has led to neighborhood tabulation areas that in many cases better reflect the underlying neighborhoods that they were intended to represent in the first place and that the CDs represent. And this also achieves a goal of NCAs that we had in mind in city planning, which is to serve as kind of pseudo sub-districts to CDs. So you can see them as sort of a part A, part B of their the CD that they comprise. So a bit more about these neighborhood tabulation areas and how they've changed this go around, kind of how we see them at city planning. So we call NTAs, neighborhood tabulation areas, medium-sized statistical geographies. I'll expand on what I mean by that in a second. But they are also built by combining census tracts, and as I said, they now fit within CDTAs. They were originally created and intended to project population at a sub-borough level, but of course they've gone on to have many use cases beyond that. I can now that we have the 2020 census data out, I can say that the 2020 NTAs have an average population of 45,000 now because of some of the growth we've had in our population over the past decade. It used to be closer to 40,000, so now it's up to 45,000. And one thing to keep in mind with as we're creating NTAs, we're always thinking about this 15,000 kind of minimum threshold that we didn't want to go below with any particular NTA. And the reason for that is we were thinking about the American Community Survey and the sample size, and concerned about the sample size not being large enough if we were to create an NTA that dipped below 15,000 people. We see that as a bit of a danger zone. And so one thing you'll see is that whenever there's neighborhoods that are a little bit on the smaller side, we will group them together to try and cross that 15,000 person threshold. It's a little bit more common in some boroughs like Staten Island, which has smaller neighborhoods than others. Now, what did I mean when I said that NTAs are medium-sized statistical geographies? Well, on one hand, you have the census tracts that the Census Bureau publishes, which are fine-grained, small areas. But again, we're worried about the sample size you're getting with the ACS there. We're worried about the reliability of the data that you're getting for census tracts. So even though it's fine-grained, there are those concerns. And then on the other hand, the CDTAs or Pumas, if you like, or even CDs, it's a much larger area, so we're not concerned so much about getting reliable data. You've got a good sample size there. But if you want to know the difference between what's going on in Greenpoint and Williamsburg, you're not going to be able to get at that if you just have the data for the entire CD. So we then turn to the neighborhood tabulation areas as sort of the Goldilocks geography, or providing a nice balance of reliable data, but more geographic specificity and more flexibility with the kind of analyses you can do, more fine-grained analyses. A little bit more on what are NTAs or what are they not. So we don't see them as being exactly neighborhoods. We want to be kind of flash that disclaimer that we're not intending to definitively represent neighborhoods or kind of put an official stamp on any particular boundaries. Neighborhood tabulation areas seek to roughly approximate what New Yorkers think of as neighborhoods, or as I said, groupings of neighborhoods when they're small and we need to put them together to cross that minimum population threshold. But why even do this? Why even try to roughly approximate neighborhoods? Well, we think that this helps make the subborough data more relatable and accessible. For example, if you hear a statistic for, Census Tract 171.02, unless you're really familiar with that particular census tract, that probably doesn't mean much to you. It's kind of hard to wrap your mind around that concept. Whereas if you hear the population for East Williamsburg is this, or the foreign-born population of Elmhurst is that. If you know the neighborhoods of New York City, that's something you can kind of wrap your mind around. That's something you can relate to better. And that's what we're going for with trying to make this medium-sized geography aligned with neighborhoods to the extent that we can. Now, NTAs do have names, but we also want to caution that we don't intend for these names to be definitive or exhaustive of all the possible names that are out there and are certainly legitimate for conceptions of neighborhoods throughout the city. A good case in point for all of this is Prospect Heights in Brooklyn. So what is Prospect Heights, or where is Prospect Heights as a concept? Well, I turned to Google Maps, and in the image you see here on the left, I just clicked on Prospect Heights there, and I saw the boundaries that Google Maps gives me. They have Flatbush Avenue to the west, over to Washington Avenue in the east, and then Atlantic Avenue in the north. And so let's say that many, if not most people, agree with these boundaries sort of for Prospect Heights. Okay, and that's what we want to go for. That's what we want to try to represent. Well, if you look on the image on the right, where I show the census tracts that we select to create the NTA representing Prospect Heights, you see that it's not a perfect match. We're dealing with these kind of bulky bricks that census tracts are. They're an amalgamation of different blocks that don't follow the streets that we would necessarily want to choose. So we're never going to get a perfect representation of Prospect Heights, and that's assuming that you even agree with the way Google Maps has it. So we like to say take the boundaries that you see with NCAs with a grain of salt. They're sort of rough approximations, and then fit within the CDTAs. Now, NTA codes have changed for 2020, and we did this kind of hand in hand with the introduction of the codes for the CDTAs. And we think this is a great improvement because for several reasons. So it's a 6-character code. The first 4 characters exactly match whatever CDTA the NTA is a constituent of. So you will always know the borough and the CD that an NTA is a part of just from the first 4 digits. So as an example, I laid out all 4 NTAs that are a part of Brooklyn CD1 here. So it's BK01. And then we have a 5th character that indicates a type. These are all zeros, so I'll explain what the types are on the next slide. And then the 6th digit creates a unique ID ties it all together for each NTA. And you see how this compares with the NTA codes that we had in the past, which didn't have a clear logic for certainly what CD an NTA was a part of, or even what the neighbors were. Like nothing would really tell you that East Williamsburg BK90 was in any way associated with BK73. So now you know that this group of NTAs is a part of the same CD, and you no longer need a lookup table for your NTAs if you want to know where they are as far as the CD. You just have to cut off the last 2 digits, and you've got your CD right there. Now, what is that 5th digit on the code? What is that type code that I mentioned? Well, most NTAs will have a 0 there, indicating that it's a residential NTA. That's going to be most of the areas that have any substantial level of population. Then we have park areas, which will be represented with a 9. The airports have an 8. You see cemeteries 7. 6, other special areas that includes the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Sunnyside Yards, a few of the forts like Fort Hamilton, Fort Wadsworth, special areas like that are sort of walled off special districts and that have low or many cases 0 population. So those are separated out. And then Rikers Island has a code of 5 in the 5th digit code there. Now, to summarize all of the changes as far as residential NTAs go, there were 188 in 2010. There's been a net increase to 197 in 2020. The main reason for that increase is as we were kind of reconfiguring them to fit within the CDTAs, we of course had those situations where, such as you saw in Lower Manhattan, where CDs 1 and 2 were separated when previously they were combined. Well, the NTA that was fitting within that Puma previously combined Tribeca with Soho, Little Italy, and that was actually straddling the CD line. So when we created these new NTAs, anywhere where a CDTA boundary was now cutting through an NTA, we of course had to split out. So now you'll see a standalone Tribeca Civic Center NTA and a Soho Little Italy NTA, so separated out. There's a couple areas throughout the city where things like that happen. Then on the other hand, we also have increases, due to areas like Long Island City, where there was substantial population growth, which allowed us to separate neighborhoods that had previously been combined because they were too small to stand alone. So Long Island City, Hunters Point had previously been joined together with Sunnyside in Western Queens. Now that Long Island City has grown so much, it stands alone, and Sunnyside stands alone as their own NCAs. So there's also an increase due to some population growth there. Now, overall, 39 of the residential NCAs have exactly the same boundaries as in 2010. So that's 20% of the total, meaning that 80% of the NCAs changed in some way. So that might sound pretty dramatic, but if you've looked at the NCAs, the 2020 NCAs already, or when you do, I think you'll see that many of the NCAs, most of them, are pretty recognizable with what they were. Many of them differ by a tract or two, and a lot of it has to do with, again, with just the way the CDTA boundary changed as opposed to the Puma previously. And so some NTAs may have buffed out or tucked in depending on which way the boundary went. But in many cases, we actually see those changes as improving the representation of the neighborhood that each NTA was trying to represent. So hopefully you agree that those are improvements. Now, as far as non-residential NTAs go, there's a pretty big difference here. We had 7 in the 2010 version, 65 now. Now, what's the reason for that? Well, previously, if you looked at for any given borough, there was this large, multi-part, non-contiguous parks, cemeteries, etc. NTA that just included everything that wasn't a residential area. For example, in Queens, you had Forest Park and parts of Jamaica Bay and Flushing Meadows, Corona Park, all joined in there, and then the airports were separated out. We've found that those large multi-part polygons were a bit unwieldy. We went for a concept this go around where we separate all the parks into their own polygons. So you end up with 40 separate polygons representing park areas, 14 cemeteries. The 2 airports are still separate, and you've got Rikers Island and those 8 other special areas that have low or no population. Now, a note on the names for NTAs and just a little bit of how we kind of shifted our philosophy around the naming in a couple of points. So one is that when dealing with the cardinal directions, like north, east, southwest, we wanted to make a distinction between cardinal directions that were really a part of a neighborhood name, as in East Harlem, like the east is part of the name, as opposed to cardinal directions that are just indicating that we have split a neighborhood into parts, and we're just dealing with either the north, south, east, or west section of that neighborhood, but we're not trying to rebrand a neighborhood or contend that there's some fancy new area out there called Gravesend South or something like that. It's just that Gravesend was large, or it was split by a CD line. We had to split it into multiple NTAs. So you see Gravesend, and we add parentheses, Gravesend South. And East Harlem, you see, there's a south and a north part, so we've done East Harlem, parentheses, south and north. Now, with some very large neighborhoods, such as the Upper East Side, also the Upper West Side, some others, that actually have sort of these subsections. We had a slight issue in the past where it would not be so much trouble on a map, but if you're dealing with filtering a table or selecting from a drop-down list, especially, sometimes if a data user query Upper East Side, looking for data on the Upper East Side, you query that, you only get one hit, Upper East Side, Carnegie Hill. You may grab that and think you're getting data for the entire Upper East Side and not be aware that you're missing out on the two other kind of NTA parts of the broader Upper East Side, Lenox Hill, Roosevelt Island, and Yorkville. So what we've done with those mega neighborhoods, as I've called them here, is we will repeat the overarching name, so Upper East Side, and then hyphenated affixed will be the sub-district name or the sub-neighborhood name. So it's Upper East Side, Carnegie Hill, Upper East Side, Lenox Hill, and so on. Now I want to briefly see if I can quiz the audience here, or just see what you think. You can guess. What do you think is the most common cardinal direction, so north, south, east, west, to show up as part of an NTA name? And I'm excluding the parks, I'm excluding non-residential areas for this quiz. And then I'm also interested to know what you think is the most common name element in NTA outside of the cardinal directions. So the options are bay, hill, park, or heights. So give everyone a moment to think about that. I think we may have a poll, if that's right. Any guesses so far? I can't see the. Oh, I'm seeing some guesses rolling here. Tilted towards south right now. Every direction's got a little bit. Give everyone another second. All right, so we're kind of tied between south and east. I'm going to end that poll. I'm going to go on to the next slide and reveal the answer here. I can, sorry. So whoever said east, you're correct. East is actually a pretty clear winner there. 26 NCAs have east somewhere in the name. I was kind of hinting at it with the last slide there. I had Upper East Side and East Harlem. If you think about it, there's East Chester, East New York, the Lower East Side. There's a lot going on the East Side. And then the second question really surprised me. Hill takes the cake there. I would have thought Heights or at least Park would have taken it. But then the more I thought about it, the more it made sense because, you know, we've got two Murray Hills, Manhattan and Queens Murray Hill, Marble Hill that I've mentioned a few times. Staten Island is full of hills. There's Clinton Hill in Brooklyn, a few hills elsewhere. So thanks for indulging me with that quiz. Now I'm going to go on with some superlatives that I can talk about. Following the results of the 2020 census now, we know a little bit more about our new NTAs here. The largest NTA as far as population size is Elmhurst in Queens, which has nearly 108,000 people. That's more than twice the average NTA size. So the average NTA size is 44,650. Remember I said it was around 45,000 earlier. And the smallest NTA population-wise is Hunts Point in the Bronx. And we were a little worried about this one because remember our 15,000 minimum threshold there. And happily, Hunts Point just edged over that threshold. So we're pleased with the sample size we're getting there for the ACS. And now as far as the fastest growing NTA, I mentioned it previously, Long Island City, Hunters Point, which nearly tripled in size, adding over 21,000 people. That compares with the average population increase for NCAs, which was about 7%, a little over 7%, or 3,000 people. The largest decline for an NTA was Washington Heights South, the southern section of Washington Heights, which lost over 5,000 people, or nearly 7% decline. So now I just want to briefly talk about census tracts, how and why they change, where some of the changes are following the 2020 census, and they've served as kind of the building blocks for all these larger geographies. As I mentioned at the beginning, census tracts are themselves aggregations of census blocks, so that's smallest area for which the Census Bureau publishes data, and they fit within counties, so they fit within the boroughs in New York City. They're small area geographies. They're intended to have relatively permanent boundaries, so they don't change too much, but I will talk about the changes. Now, nationally, census tracts have an average population of around 4,000 people. It tends to be a bit higher in New York City, especially Manhattan, just because of the density here. I'll talk about how that factors into the changes. And then there's also special use tracts, which can have 0 or no population, and these tend to represent special areas like large parks or airports, and that corresponds with some of those same special NTAs that I called out earlier. Now, why and how do census tracts change? Typically has to do with population change or with new housing construction, which closely usually precedes population change. So when population has increased substantially or new housing construction is increasing substantially, typically that's when you would split or subdivide a census tract so as to maintain close to that 4,000 average population size. And if a census tract were to lose a lot of population or lose housing units, then you consider merging census tracts together. The Census Bureau would consider merging census tracts together to maintain, again, that 4,000 average nationally. Now, when census tracts split or merge, they do so, or the Census Bureau tries to have them do so in a way that maintains the outer boundaries so that they can maintain historical continuity. So I've illustrated what I mean by that above with Census Tract 40.0 in Manhattan. That was the 2010 Census Tract on the left, which was split for 2020 into 40.01, 40.02. You see it was done so it maintains that outer box, splits along the middle. If you wanted to go back in time to compare to previous censuses, you would have to just add 40.01 and 40.02 together. Similarly, if the census tract were to merge, you could do sort of the reverse process where you go back in time, merge the 2010 census tracts together to take it forward and compare to the future. Now, census tracts also can be split for non-population reasons as long as they are viable population-wise. And that's what I was discussing earlier when city planning worked with the Census Bureau to split tracts along CD lines to help us represent our community districts better. So I just wanted to show this screenshot here to illustrate where a lot of the action was this decade as far as census tract splits. I can report, first of all, that there were no census tracts in New York City this decade that lost population to the extent that they would have to be merged. So there were no population-based merges of census tracts. There were a fair number of splits. So the pink tracts that you see here are highlighting 2010 census tracts that were split for 2020. Now, if you're familiar with where a lot of housing unit construction has happened over the past decade, that some of these pink areas won't be that surprising to you. You see nearly every census tract in the Long Island City and northern Greenpoint area there were split due to the massive amounts of construction there. We also had quite a few tract splits along the western side of Manhattan, along the Hudson there, corresponding with the construction activity in Hudson Yards area, Lincoln Center area. And then there's a fair number of splits along the east side, which also had a fair amount of new construction. So to summarize the census tract changes overall within New York City, 94% of the 2010 census tracts are actually unchanged in 2020. So it's only the 6% that have changed. The net effect of that is to an increase from 2168 census tracts in 2010 to 2327 in 2020. Of the 131 2010 census tracts that were split, 63 were done due to population or housing unit increases, and the bulk of those were where I just showed you on that previous map, the previous slide. 39 were split along community district boundaries, so that's the work that we did to build better CDTAs. And then 29 were split to define special use areas, such as parks, cemeteries, and industrial areas that hadn't been separated out before. I know one example of this is Shirley Chisholm State Park along Jamaica Bay was split out, and it hadn't been before. Now I said there were no merges due to population changes, but there were two partial split merges, and these both occurred next to special use areas. So next to Brooklyn Navy Yard, next to Sunnyside Yards. And what happened here is both of those tracts contained a small portion where housing construction actually occurred. So the small portion, I think it really was just a block in the case of Sunnyside Yards and a few blocks for the Brooklyn Navy Yard, were carved off of those census tracts so that the yards could remain those special use census tracts with no population or little population. And the area that had the housing unit construction was then merged to the residential tract adjacent. So just wanted to call that to your attention. Now, I also wanted to highlight the densest census tract in New York City, which I believe has now taken the title of densest census tract in the United States, back from Chicago, which had taken it in 2010. There's kind of an anomalous census tract in Chicago that only contains one or two high-rise buildings that had an incredibly high population density. But then on the Upper East Side, we had another residential high-rise constructed in this census tract, which put it over the edge with 287,000 persons per square mile. So I believe that is the densest census tract in the country now. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some resources for where you can actually, if you haven't already, download the boundaries and data for all of these geographies that I'm talking about. We're going to share the slides with everyone here after the presentation. So I've included a bunch of links here. I think Amy was going to drop some in the chat for you to check out. If you're interested in downloading the boundary shape files, those are available on City Planning's Bites of the Big Apple census webpage. So you can get the tracks, the new NTAs, the CDTAs, and even the Pumas on there. We also have posted on our website the Centennial Census data for 2020, 2010, and the change between the two, all in terms of the new 2020 geographies. That's on our Population Division website there. We've also posted 2015 to 19 5-year ACS data in 2020 NTA and CDTA terms. That's available on our website there. And I just want to actually go to this last link here, which is our geographic relationship page, where we've got a couple of useful links here, including a story map that kind of talks through a lot of what I presented here today for your reference. We also have a great atlas that I like to look at that illustrates the change from 2010 to 2020 geographies. So you'll see a kind of a slider bar, and you can move it across the map and see the 2010 boundaries change to the 2020 in different colors. We've also posted 2010 to 2020 census tract population proportions and a 2020 census tract and block relationship files, so that you can intra 2020 know what tract relates to what NTA and what CDTA and so on. So going back to the slides. Again, this is a link directly to that atlas that I mentioned, where you can see the 2010 geographies in red on the left, 2020 on the right, and slide back and forth between the two to visualize the changes. And lastly, I'm very happy to announce that just yesterday, this went live online, the new update to our population fact finder, New York City population fact finder application, which you can use to create custom aggregations of all of the geographies that I've talked about today. So you can, if you're have a different study area that doesn't correspond to any CD or NTA, you can actually aggregate census tracts and calculate data for that on the fly, download a CSV for your study area. And this has been updated with the 2020 geographies and data. So I'm going to go there now and just show you a little bit what it looks like. It'll be pretty familiar if you've been to Fact Finder at all before, but it's updated with the 2020 geographies now. You can create a selection, view the data for that selection, it'll calculate, aggregate, and you've got the 2020 data here. You can click on a data source, change it to change over time. You can see the ACS, we've got that in 2020 geographic terms. I'm going to go back to the map here. You see it started in Census Tract, but along the top bar here, I can switch to the neighborhood tabulation areas. I can, perhaps I'm interested in seeing the data for East Harlem and Harlem together. I can do that here. I can clear my selection. Also see the CDTAs, the exact community districts, which only provides decennial data for ACS data. You would go to the community district tabulation areas. You can also view blocks, boroughs, or just get data for New York City as a whole, if you're interested in that. I do want to highlight one other function here, which is a couple of map layers that you can add, including thematic maps. Variables from both the decennial census and ACS that you can select. So I'm going to turn on the change in the Hispanic population, 2010 to 2020 census here, and you see this will create some quick visualizations of all these variables here. So looking at the Hispanic change, you can see, I'll scroll back up to the legend here. Significant increases represented in blue, relative stability represented in white, and significant declines in red. And this could be helpful if you're interested, first of all, in just getting a quick visualization of some of these variables in NTA by NTA, or help you make a selection if maybe you're interested in what's going on in this corridor where you've seen increases across Southern Brooklyn. Here you can select all of these NTAs based on what you're seeing and view the data for that aggregation and see what you get. So with that, I did want to say that I've got my email on here. So any questions that you come up with after this presentation, I'd be happy to, if you shoot me an email, I can point you to the right place about geographies or 2020 census changes. Happy to answer, but I'm also happy to take your questions now. Thanks for listening to my talk.